Most people believe they want success, discipline, mastery, control over their mind and life, but what they are actually addicted to is being seen wanting those things, because somewhere along the way, effort stopped being a private contract with the self and became a public performance measured by attention, reactions, approval, and acknowledgement. And this shift did not happen loudly or maliciously. It happened slowly, socially, almost invisibly, reinforced every time effort was praised instead of completed, every time intention was celebrated instead of execution, every time struggle was admired more than endurance. And over time, the mind learned a dangerous association, that action only mattered when someone else was watching, that work only felt real when it was noticed, that discipline only felt rewarding when it was validated. And once that association forms, solitude becomes threatening, silence becomes uncomfortable, and unseen effort feels pointless, because the nervous system has been trained to expect external feedback as proof of existence. And this is how performance culture quietly reshapes identity, not by discouraging effort, but by redirecting its reward away from results and toward visibility, away from structure and toward symbolism, away from private progress and toward public narrative, until a person no longer asks, "Am I improving?" but instead asks, "Do they see me improving?" And this subtle shift changes everything, because effort that depends on witnesses becomes fragile, inconsistent, and emotionally volatile, rising when attention is present and collapsing when it disappears, which is why so many people start strong and fade silently, why consistency dies when novelty ends, why discipline feels impossible in empty rooms, because they were never trained to act without reinforcement, only to perform effort in exchange for recognition. And this is not a character flaw, it is a conditioning problem. Because from early on, people are rewarded for being noticed, praised for being expressive, encouraged to announce, share, display, explain, while quiet persistence is ignored, invisible, unrewarded. And the mind learns what the environment reinforces. It learns that being seen trying feels better than being alone succeeding, that public struggle feels safer than private responsibility, that announcing plans feels like progress because it produces immediate emotional relief, even though it produces no structural change. And over time, this creates the strange illusion where effort feels constant but growth is minimal, where activity is high but results are low, where exhaustion exists without transformation, because energy is being spent maintaining an image rather than building capacity, and the person becomes busy but not dangerous, visible but not effective, expressive but not disciplined. And they often don't realize this is happening because performance culture disguises itself as productivity. It praises hustle aesthetics, visible grind, loud ambition, while quietly punishing patience, repetition, boredom, and silence. And so people begin narrating their journey instead of walking it, documenting their struggle instead of enduring it, explaining their discipline instead of embodying it, because narration provides instant emotional payoff, while real discipline provides delayed, uncertain, often lonely rewards. And the brain, always seeking the path of least emotional resistance, begins choosing the former, until effort itself becomes theatrical, optimized for consumption rather than completion, shaped for reactions rather than outcomes. And once effort turns performative, it starts to decay internally, because the moment the audience disappears, the motivation evaporates, the structure weakens, the rituals break, and the person is left alone with a question they have been avoiding. If no one was watching, would I still do this? And for many, the answer is deeply uncomfortable, because it exposes how much of their discipline was borrowed from external pressure, how much of their consistency was sustained by observation, how much of their identity relied on being mirrored by others. And this realization often triggers anxiety rather than clarity, because silence removes the external scaffolding that was holding the self together. And without witnesses, there is no immediate confirmation of worth. no reassurance of direction, no social proof that effort matters. And instead of sitting with that uncertainty and rebuilding from the inside, most people flee back to noise, back to posting, back to explaining, back to seeking engagement, because noise feels like control and visibility feels like existence, even when nothing meaningful is being built underneath. And this is why performance culture is not just distracting, it is corrosive, because it replaces internal authority with external feedback loops. And once effort becomes dependent on feedback, discipline becomes conditional, fragile, and reactive, no longer governed by principle, but by response, no longer anchored to outcome, but to appearance. And the person slowly loses the ability to work in silence, not because they lack willpower, but because silence deprives them of the emotional rewards they have grown dependent on. And so private effort begins to feel empty, unrewarding, even pointless, because the dopamine system has been hijacked, no longer releasing satisfaction from progress itself, but from acknowledgement of progress. And this creates a dangerous inversion where being praised for effort feels better than actually becoming capable, where being seen working feels better than actually finishing, where starting feels better than sustaining. And this is why so many lives are filled with beginnings and so few with completion, why plans multiply while results stagnate, why people know the language of discipline but not its weight. Because real discipline is quiet, repetitive, emotionally unrewarding in the short term, and often misunderstood from the outside. And performance culture offers an easier alternative, visible effort with immediate social payoff, even if it produces no lasting change. And the tragedy is that this alternative feels productive enough to delay self-confrontation indefinitely, because as long as effort is being displayed, the person can avoid the harder question of whether it is actually working, whether it is changing them, whether it is building anything durable beneath the surface. And this avoidance becomes a lifestyle, a loop of announcing, starting, sharing, reacting, repeating, while the deeper capacity to endure boredom, isolation, and delayed gratification atrophies until the person becomes uncomfortable being alone with their work, uneasy without an audience, restless in silence, because silence exposes the absence of structure, the lack of internal discipline, the dependency on being seen. And this dependency is not loud or dramatic, it is subtle and socially acceptable, even admired, because it looks like ambition, it looks like passion, it looks like hustle. But beneath it, there is instability, because anything that requires constant observation to exist will collapse when observation is removed, and strength that cannot survive in silence is not strength, it is performance. And the mind knows this, even if the ego resists it, which is why many people feel a vague sense of dissatisfaction despite being busy, a quiet anxiety despite being active, a hollow fatigue despite constant effort, because somewhere deep they recognize that much of what they are doing is being done for witnesses rather than outcomes, for validation rather than mastery. And this realization often triggers anxiety rather than clarity, because silence removes the external scaffolding that was holding the self together. And without witnesses, there is no immediate confirmation of worth, no reassurance of direction, no social proof that effort matters. And instead of sitting with that uncertainty and rebuilding from the inside, most people flee back to noise, back to posting, back to explaining, back to seeking engagement, because noise feels like control and visibility feels like existence, even when nothing meaningful is being built underneath. And this is why performance culture is not just distracting, it is corrosive, because it replaces internal authority with external feedback loops. And once effort becomes dependent on feedback, discipline becomes conditional, fragile, and reactive, no longer governed by principle, but by response, no longer anchored to outcome, but to appearance. And the person slowly loses the ability to work in silence, not because they lack willpower, but because silence deprives them of the emotional rewards they have grown dependent on. And so private effort begins to feel empty, unrewarding, even pointless, because the dopamine system has been hijacked, no longer releasing satisfaction from progress itself, but from acknowledgement of progress. And this creates a dangerous inversion where being praised for effort feels better than actually becoming capable, where being seen working feels better than actually finishing, where starting feels better than sustaining. And this is why so many lives are filled with beginnings and so few with completion, why plans multiply while results stagnate, why people know the language of discipline but not its weight, because real discipline is quiet, repetitive, emotionally unrewarding in the short term, and often misunderstood from the outside. And performance culture offers an easier alternative, visible effort with immediate social payoff, even if it produces no lasting change. And the tragedy is that this alternative feels productive and
Public effort feels productive because it looks productive, because it creates motion, dialogue, feedback, and a sense of momentum that mimics real progress without demanding its cost. And this is why it is so seductive, especially in a world that rewards visibility faster than results. Because when effort is performed publicly, it generates instant signals of movement, comments, reactions, acknowledgement, comparison. And these signals trick the mind into believing something meaningful is happening, even when nothing structural is changing underneath. Because the brain is not designed to distinguish between progress and the appearance of progress. It only recognizes stimulation and response. And public effort provides both in abundance, which is why announcing plans feels energizing, sharing routines feels satisfying, documenting struggle feels purposeful, even though none of these actions move the needle unless followed by sustained private execution. And this is the core lie of public effort, that effort expressed is effort completed, that intention communicated is intention fulfilled, that visibility substitutes for endurance. And the danger is not that public effort is useless, but that it becomes a replacement for the harder, quieter work that actually produces results. Because once effort is externalized, it begins serving two masters, the outcome and the audience. And slowly, almost imperceptibly, the audience takes control, shaping how effort is performed, when it is displayed, what parts are emphasized, what parts are hidden, until effort itself becomes optimized for perception rather than effectiveness, and the person starts choosing actions that look impressive instead of actions that are necessary, actions that are easy to explain instead of actions that are hard to sustain, actions that generate quick feedback instead of actions that require long periods of silence. And this shift rarely feels like compromise in the moment, because public effort provides emotional rewards that private effort withholds. It provides reassurance, confirmation, a sense of belonging, a feeling of being on the right path. And for a mind that is uncertain, impatient, or validation dependent, these rewards feel essential, but they come at a cost that is not immediately visible. They weaken the capacity for delayed gratification, they erode tolerance for boredom, they shorten the attention span required for mastery, and they slowly teach the nervous system that effort should always be accompanied by recognition. And once that expectation is set, private work begins to feel disproportionately difficult, not because it is harder, but because it is unrewarded, because it offers no immediate emotional payoff, no external proof of worth, no social reinforcement, only repetition, uncertainty, and the quiet question of whether any of it is working. And most people are not trained to sit with that question. They are trained to escape it through expression, through explanation, through sharing, through turning inward processes into outward performances. And this is why public effort often expands while private discipline shrinks, because the former feels alive and the latter feels empty, even though the latter is the only one that builds anything real. And over time, this imbalance creates a strange phenomenon where people are constantly working on themselves, but rarely becoming more capable, constantly grinding, but never arriving anywhere, constantly busy, but structurally unchanged, because their energy is being siphoned into maintaining an image of effort, rather than constructing systems of effort.
And this image maintenance is exhausting because it requires constant engagement, constant response, constant explanation, and the mind becomes trapped in a loop of signaling productivity instead of producing outcomes. And the tragedy is that this loop is socially rewarded, praised, normalized, and even monetized, which makes it harder to detect because the environment validates the behavior even as it undermines long-term strength. And so people learn to measure progress by reaction rather than result, by attention rather than ability, by visibility rather than capacity. And once these metrics take hold, effort becomes distorted because actions that cannot be easily shown, summarized, or celebrated are deprioritized, even if they are essential, while actions that can be displayed are inflated, even if they are marginal. And slowly, the discipline required for mastery is replaced by the discipline required for performance, which is a completely different skill set, because performance discipline focuses on timing, presentation, and perception, while real discipline focuses on consistency, structure, and repetition. And the two often conflict because the most effective work is rarely the most impressive-looking work, and the most important repetitions are often the most boring, unshareable, and unremarkable, which is why mastery has always required a degree of invisibility, a willingness to work through phases where nothing can be shown, nothing can be explained, nothing can be celebrated, only endured. And public effort disrupts this process by encouraging premature exposure, premature narration, premature identity formation, because once someone publicly identifies with a goal, a routine, or a path, they feel pressure to maintain that identity even if it is not working, because abandoning it publicly feels like failure, while continuing privately would require humility and silence. And so many people double down on ineffective methods simply because they have already announced them, because they have already been seen pursuing them. And the audience becomes an invisible constraint, shaping decisions not based on effectiveness, but on consistency of image. And this is where public effort becomes actively harmful, because it locks people into suboptimal behaviors to preserve perception. And over time, the gap between appearance and reality widens, creating internal tension, because the person senses they are not progressing as expected, yet they are invested in maintaining the story of progress. And this tension often manifests as anxiety, irritability, burnout, because the mind is trying to reconcile two conflicting realities, the image of discipline and the absence of results. And instead of resolving this conflict by withdrawing from performance and recommitting to private work, most people attempt to manage it by increasing output, increasing visibility, increasing explanation, hoping that more noise will compensate for the lack of depth. But noise never builds structure, it only masks its absence temporarily. And eventually, the mask fails, because results are unforgiving. They arrive only when the underlying work has been done, regardless of how impressive the effort looked along the way. And when results do not arrive, the illusion of public effort collapses, leaving behind exhaustion and confusion, because the person did everything they were supposed to do according to the visible rules of productivity, yet nothing materialized. And this moment is often interpreted as bad luck, lack of talent, or external obstacles, when in reality it is the delayed consequence of substituting visibility for substance. And the uncomfortable truth is that real work is often indistinguishable from inactivity from the outside, because it involves long periods of repetition, refinement, failure, and adjustment that produce no immediate signal. And public effort teaches people to fear those phases, to fill them with updates, explanations, and performative motion, rather than respecting them as necessary phases of growth. And this fear of appearing inactive is one of the strongest barriers to mastery, because it pushes people to act prematurely, to switch paths too early, to abandon processes that require time, simply to maintain the appearance of progress. And this is why public effort creates shallow trajectories, rapid starts followed by stagnation, enthusiasm followed by exhaustion, because it rewards movement without direction and punishes stillness even even when stillness is required. And the most dangerous aspect of this lie is that it feels virtuous, because effort is being exerted, time is being spent, energy is being invested, yet the investment is misallocated, poured into signaling rather than compounding, into expression rather than construction. And until a person recognizes that public effort is not neutral but actively shapes behavior, they will continue mistaking activity for advancement. And this recognition is difficult because it requires withdrawing from applause, resisting explanation, tolerating invisibility, and accepting that for a long time there will be nothing to show, nothing to share, nothing to validate the work except the work itself. And here the path splits, because one direction leads back to performance, comfort, and familiar feedback, while the other leads into quiet, unacknowledged labor that feels unrewarded but builds something that cannot be taken away. And most people choose the former not because they are weak, but because the latter offers no immediate emotional compensation, no reassurance, no proof, only the slow accumulation of capacity. And yet it is only through this accumulation that inevitable results are born, because results do not respond to effort that is seen, they respond to effort that is sustained, and sustained effort almost always happens away from the audience, away from the noise, away from the stage, in places where no one is counting, clapping, or caring. And until a person accepts that public effort is a lie, comforting, socially rewarded, but structurally empty, they will continue working hard without becoming formidable, visible without being effective, and busy without being dangerous.
There's a moment that almost no one prepares for, a moment that arrives quietly after the excitement fades and the audience thins, when the noise that once surrounded effort dissolves, and what remains is a long stretch of unobserved time, repetitive tasks, uncertain progress, and no immediate feedback. And this is the threshold of the unseen grind, the place where discipline either becomes real or quietly dies. Because the unseen grind does not reward enthusiasm, it does not respond to intention, it does not care how strong the beginning felt, it only responds to consistency under conditions that feel emotionally unrewarding. And most people misinterpret the discomfort of this phase as a sign that something is wrong, that motivation is missing, that the path is flawed, when in reality the discomfort is simply the absence of witnesses, the removal of external reinforcement, and the exposure of how dependent effort had become on being observed. And this is why the unseen grind feels heavier than it should, not because the work is objectively harder, but because the mind is no longer being compensated with validation, no longer distracted by feedback, no longer reassured by reaction. And without those signals, the nervous system panics slightly, searching for confirmation that the effort matters, that it is leading somewhere, that it is not being wasted. And when that confirmation does not arrive, doubt fills the space, not the dramatic kind, but a low-level erosion that asks quietly, day after day, why continue? And this is where most people turn back, because the unseen grind offers nothing to hold on to except process. And process feels empty to a mind trained on outcomes and applause. Yet this emptiness is precisely what makes the unseen grind transformative, because it forces effort to detach from emotion, from identity signaling, from performance, and reattach to structure, repetition, and internal standards. And this transition is not comfortable because it requires the ego to shrink. It requires the self to operate without mirrors. It requires the person to measure progress in private, often imperfect ways, and to trust that compounding is happening even when it cannot be felt. And this trust is not faith, it is a skill developed through repetition, through showing up on days that feel indistinguishable from failure, through completing tasks that produce no visible reward, through continuing when the mind insists that nothing is changing,
because the unseen grind is where time finally begins to work in your favor, not because it becomes exciting, but because it becomes boring enough to sustain. And boredom is the true gatekeeper of mastery, not difficulty, because difficulty can be stimulating, dramatic, even motivating, while boredom is flat, repetitive, emotionally neutral, and demands a different kind of strength, the strength to persist without stimulation, to repeat without novelty, to refine without recognition. And when someone enters the unseen grind fully, something subtle begins to happen. Their relationship with effort changes, because effort is no longer something they perform, it becomes something they execute. No longer something they talk about, but something they schedule. No longer something that defines their identity outwardly, but something that structures their days inwardly. And this shift reduces friction, because effort is no longer negotiated emotionally each day, it is simply enacted. And this is where discipline begins to harden, because discipline thrives on predictability, on systems, on rituals that operate regardless of mood. And the unseen grind strips away the emotional drama that often surrounds self-improvement, leaving behind a simpler, harsher reality. Do the work or don't, without justification, without explanation, without an audience to impress. And many people discover here that they have been relying on emotion to fuel consistency, using motivation as a trigger to act. And when that emotion disappears, they feel powerless. But those who stay learn a different mechanism. They learn to attach action to time, to environment, to rules rather than feelings. And this mechanical approach feels cold at first, almost inhuman, because it removes the narrative of passion and replaces it with obligation. But obligation is far more reliable than inspiration, because it does not fluctuate with confidence or attention. And in the unseen grind, obligation becomes a stabilizing force, a quiet agreement with the self that does not require witnesses to enforce it. And over time, this agreement builds a form of self-trust that cannot be achieved through public effort, because it is forged in conditions where quitting would go unnoticed, where shortcuts would remain hidden, where only personal integrity determines whether the work gets done. And integrity exercised privately has a different weight than integrity displayed publicly, because there is no social cost to failure, only an internal one. And learning to care about that internal cost more than external perception is one of the most difficult psychological shifts a person can make, because it requires valuing future capability over present comfort, delayed outcome over immediate reassurance. And this valuation is not natural, it is trained, repetition by repetition, decision by decision, in moments that feel small and insignificant. Yet these moments accumulate, and slowly the unseen grind begins to change how effort feels, not by making it exciting, but by making it familiar. And familiarity reduces resistance, because the mind no longer expects a reward at the end of each session. It begins to accept effort as a baseline state rather than an exceptional event. And this acceptance is dangerous in the best way, because it removes the drama that often sabotages long-term progress, the cycles of hype and disappointment, the emotional highs and crashes, replacing them with a steady, almost indifferent continuation. And in this state, progress becomes quieter but more consistent, slower but more reliable, because it is no longer competing with the need to be seen. And this is why people who master the unseen grind often appear calm, even detached, because their effort is not fueled by urgency or fear of judgment, but by routine. And routine is emotionally neutral, which allows energy to be conserved and directed toward refinement rather than self-regulation. And refinement is where real improvement occurs, not in bursts of effort, but in small adjustments made repeatedly over time, adjustments that are too subtle to showcase, too boring to explain, but decisive in their cumulative effect.
And the unseen grind provides the space for these adjustments to occur, because there is no pressure to perform, no need to exaggerate progress, no temptation to rush milestones for the sake of perception, and this freedom allows mistakes to be corrected quietly, weaknesses to be addressed honestly, and methods to be refined without embarrassment, because no one is watching. And this privacy accelerates learning because it removes the ego's need to defend an image and instead allows it to focus or effectiveness. And as this focus deepens, the person begins to experience a different kind of satisfaction, not the sharp pleasure of praise, but the dull confidence of knowing something is being built correctly, even if it is not yet visible. And this confidence is subtle, often unnoticed at first, but it stabilizes behavior because it is rooted in evidence accumulated through action rather than approval granted by others. And eventually, this internal evidence becomes enough to continue without reassurance, enough to tolerate long periods of ambiguity, enough to work without witnesses indefinitely. And this is the point where discipline becomes self-sustaining, not because it feels good, but because it feels necessary, because the system has been built, the habits installed, the rules internalized, and breaking them would feel more disruptive than continuing. And this reversal is the true reward of the unseen grind, not immediate results, but a restructuring of how effort operates, shifting from emotional to procedural, from expressive to functional, from visible to effective. And once this restructuring is complete, the person no longer fears invisibility, because invisibility is no longer associated with stagnation, but with construction. And silence is no longer interpreted as absence of progress, but as a sign that the work has moved beneath the surface, where it compounds without interference. And this is why people who survive the unseen grind often become difficult to read from the outside, because their effort is no longer broadcast, their progress no longer narrated, their identity no longer tied to performance. And when results eventually appear, they seem sudden, even surprising, to those who were not there during the quiet years. But for the one who endured the unseen grind, the results feel inevitable, not because they were guaranteed, but because the work never stopped when no one was watching.